Hey everyone, this is Elijah Johnson with FinanceandLiberty.com, and back with us today is Alasdair MacLeod from GoldMoney.com and FinanceandEconomics.org. Alasdair, thank you so much for joining us today.
That's my pleasure. Thank you, Elijah.
All right, well, I first wanted to discuss a little bit about the London Gold Fix. Now, on March 20th, there's a change coming to the London Gold Fix. Did you want to explain what this means for the physical gold market?
Yes. At the moment, and ever since 1919, I think, there has been a daily fix, and then from, I think in the 60s, it became a twice daily fix, whereby 4 or 5 bullion banks got together. All the orders at the fix were channeled through those banks, and a price was struck, which was, when there was a balance between buyers and sellers. Now, the problem with that system is that the bullion banks know all the order flows in the market, and this is very valuable information. The risk for them to game the system is actually quite large, as you may imagine, particularly given the falling standards of probity in banks in general. And this indeed has led to a certain amount of suspicion in the market that the fix is being abused. And it's not just me being a conspiracy theorist on this one. I mean, Deutsche Bank had a long investigation by the BaFin, which is the German bank regulator, last year. And nothing came out of that, incidentally, but the fact that BaFin did undergo a long and large investigation into Deutsche Bank, which culminated with Deutsche Bank withdrawing from both the fixes, by the way, and also putting its London vault up for sale, does sort of suggest that there are suspicions at every level that the fix was being gamed or not being used properly. Now, that is being replaced on March the 20th by a new fix arrangement, whereby the participants, any authorized client, as it were, who can go in, is completely anonymous during the fixing process. So it's the fundamental change is a bullion bank in the fix, where they would see the origin of the orders and they would say, gosh, the Chinese are buying, that's very important information, or the Russians are selling, or whatever the story of the day is. They would actually see that order flow. They would be able to position themselves on the back of that order flow. That is no longer the situation. So we're moving from a fix which depended really on the position of the establishment, by which I mean the sort of the coterie of the 4 or 5, and now it's 4, now that Deutsche Bank's out of it, bullion banks, in effect controlling the market through the fix, to a situation where the deepest pocket basically makes the prices in the fix. And that's a big fundamental change. And of course, the deepest pockets are the Chinese government.
Now, do you think the change in the London Gold Fix will lead to less manipulation in the gold market?
Difficult to say. And also, manipulation is something that is really very, very difficult to quantify. I think that the Western central banks can only control or influence the gold price really through the futures market. And we've seen that in recent years on several occasions. But so when it comes to the physical market, I think that central banks are probably net buyers. In Europe, the European central banks, the national central banks, as it were, within the ECB network, are under fairly substantial pressure to recall their gold from foreign centers. So we've seen this with the Bundesbank. We've seen this now with the Austrian central bank. And this is a movement that is actually gaining momentum elsewhere. So I think if you were a governor of a central bank in Europe, you're probably rather mindful that you don't really want to get rid of your gold, because this is becoming a bit of a hot issue. So I think central banks are not that much involved. What we now have, though, is we have got bullion banks who are staffed by university-educated traders who basically have learned Keynesian economics, monetary economics, not the laws of the markets. And it's their opinions that are really driving prices. So the idea that that there's any sort of rational assessment of value from a market point of view being applied via the bullion banks, I think is fundamentally wrong. You've got a combination of, if you like, maleducation, if I can coin a phrase, where these guys, they have been taught a form of economics which is anti-gold, no longer accepts gold as money, thinks that all the establishment, if you like, of the dollar as a reserve currency, completely replacing gold, is actually progress. That is the way they think, and therefore they see gold purely as a mechanism for making money. And in London, that is how can we use this asset to the best of its earning capability. So they gear up on it. They use it going round and round in circles. They pick up bank fees. They pick up interest. They pick up, everything they can possibly do. They pick up on gold, and it's not in their interest to see the price rise. So you can see that they've got this sort of natural approach to sitting on this and thinking this is no longer money. It is something that we can make an awful lot of money out of. So now, whether that's manipulation of a market or not, it's actually quite hard to say. But I think we've got these entrenched attitudes in the market, and it's that that really is making the price now rather than overt manipulation as such.
Right, and you mentioned a little bit earlier about how it seems like Chinese banks will possibly be able to now dominate after March 20th, after the fix changes. Chinese banks will now be able to dominate the London physical gold market. And you wrote in your article that it's no exaggeration to say that from March 20th, China will be able to control the global physical gold market, which will permit her to manage the price. Did you want to discuss a little bit about this?
Yes, China already, having established the Shanghai Gold Exchange, if you like, controls the largest physical delivery market in the world by far. They delivered around about 2,000 tons last year. Now, this is considerably more than is delivered into public hands in London. What happens in London with physical deliveries is they tend to be netted out, and as little as possible gold moves from one vault to another. So it is a rather different thing. Now that they have got direct access through the fix to be able to place orders on anonymously on a platform, then they can also begin to control the pricing in the London market. Now, I think this has been something which they've been working up to for a very long time. They first decided to have a policy towards developing gold reserves back in 1983, when they brought in regulations which basically appointed the People's Bank of China, which is the central bank, as having total control over gold and silver on behalf of the state. And it is really underneath that that the Bank of China has been acquiring gold, and I believe surreptitiously acquiring gold, since 1983. And since 2002, it is the People's Bank of China that has responded to the change in regulations permitting Chinese citizens to own gold privately. And on the back of that, of course, the Shanghai Gold Exchange was set up. So they've had this long-term objective of building a nest egg, if you like, for the state of gold. Now, it obviously doesn't appear on the People's Bank's books because the declared reserves are only in the order of 1,054 tons. I actually think they've got a lot more than that, and I think the figure is a figure like 20 to 25,000 tons. It could even be slightly more. This policy is also extended to mining gold at any cost. I'm sure that many of the gold mines in China, which are all state-owned or state-controlled, are not profitable. Yet they have increased their gold output solidly every year, and they're now the largest gold miner in the world by a long shot. I mean, they overtook South Africa something like 4 years ago, and last year they mined something like 450 tons. So you can see that they have put a lot of effort and energy into building their ownership of gold. They also have refineries, and they import gold doré from abroad, and that never gets seen out again on international markets. So that's all retained within China. Now, whether it's owned by the government, the Communist Party, or sold through the Shanghai Gold Exchange is actually immaterial. The point is it's all accumulating in China. So you can see that there is a deliberate policy here, and to my mind, being able to control the price of gold on the London Bullion Exchange is a logical extension of that policy that goes all the way back to 1983.
Definitely, and I was wondering if we could discuss a little bit more about China's strategy. You said in your article that at some stage, China with her SCO partner, Russia, will force the price of gold higher as part of their currency strategy. Did you want to discuss a little bit about this?
Yes, I think when China originally embarked on its policy towards gold back in 1983, I suspect it was for very similar reasons to those of the Arab nations 10 years earlier, when the price of oil rocketed up and they wanted to, they knew there was a wasting asset going out of the ground. They knew that that wouldn't be there necessarily for future generations. So they determined to buy gold, if you like, so that they would have an asset to pass on to future generations. I think it was the same sort of thought process with China when she deliberately embarked on the industrialization of her economy back in really post 1978. I think this changed around about 2002 because there had been some talk for some time, and there'd been initial attempts to get together with Russia to share common interests. And the common interests originally were really, to sort of cooperate on controlling the terrorism. You had the Chechnya terrorists and all this sort of stuff, and the Russians and the Chinese were very, very keen to ensure that they could work together to control those threats to the state. And that sort of morphed into something slightly more serious, and that became the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, whose original charter was granted in 2002, though I think it actually had started about a year before that. Now, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is basically an economic bloc which is run jointly, in effect, or dominated jointly by Russia and China. And those two countries, I mean, basically, Russia has got the resources, China has got the manufacturing capability. China knows that the West, has been extremely helpful in helping China industrialize. The inward investment in the 80s was quite phenomenal. All the major corporations like Apple and all the rest of it, they all manufacture out there. And that has been excellent. But they know that in the long term, in the long run, the West is not going to be, if you like, the real focus of her attention. She must redivert her focus back into Asia, where the majority of the world's population is. And that indeed is the whole objective of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The current members basically are Russia, China, and the various stans like Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Turkmenistan, and so on, all in the middle there between them along the Silk Road. And the joining members who have contracted to join and will join at some stage in the very near future, if not this year, it'll probably be next year, are Pakistan, India, Mongolia, Iran, Afghanistan, and those countries added to the existing membership of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization accounts for more than half the world's population. This means that you're going to have an economic bloc that's going to spread from the Bering Straits to the Great Jerusalem. This is enormous, absolutely enormous. The infrastructure which is being built at the moment is all supportive of this. The $50 billion dollar equivalent Silk Road project, which is road and rail going the whole way across the continent to Europe. This is, they really are very, very serious about this. Now, if you'd like to put in that, one of the objectives, which so far is unsatisfied, but they're making good progress towards, of the SCO, is to have their own means of trade settlement, independent from the West. And they particularly want to be independent of the dollar. And we've seen moves of all sorts, which basically have pushed in that direction. I won't go through the list, it's far too long. But what I can say is that they have been very successful in rapidly developing the ability to settle in the major Asian countries, and in this case, particularly the renminbi. I think that for that to actually work, what China is going to have to do is she is going to have to bring confidence into her own currency. And I think that's probably the strategic reason why she has acquired gold. What she wants to do is somehow to incorporate gold into the renminbi so that it is trusted and accepted across the whole of Asia and in other countries where possible as payment for trade. So that, I think, in a nutshell, is the whole reason, the whole raison d'etre from China's point of view of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. From Russia's point of view, I think it is slightly different. There is an old mantra from Mackinder. Mackinder was the man who came up with the heartland theory, and that is he who controls the heartland controls the world, or the world island, and he who controls the world island controls the world. Now, the heartland basically is from Eastern Europe, the Volga, if you like, to the Yangtze. That is the heartland, what he called the world heartland. Now, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization gives Russia, in effect, de facto control over the whole of the heartland, over the whole of what's the world island, as it were, which is not only Asia, but also Europe. Now, Europe, you might say they don't have control over, but they've got a certain amount of control over Eastern Europe, and the rest would probably come through commerce anyway. And also Africa. And if you go south of the Sahara, China pretty well controls the whole of Africa. So you can see that Mackinder's theory, which goes back to just around about slightly after the World War I, is actually that prophecy is coming true. And we do know the Russians know about this. Because they have looked at this over the years. There are various instances where this has been established. So I think that's really what's driving Putin, and I think what's driving China. And I just wish that the West actually understood this, because it does explain what their objectives are. Their objectives aren't to conquer all the sort of Latvia and all the rest of it. No, basically what Russia wants to do is to secure her borders. And I think she'll secure a currency at some stage. I think Russia can go on a gold standard. Then you have the world's largest bloc, in effect, having remonetized gold from a sort of official point of view.
Speaking about how the West hasn't really realized what they've let China and Russia do, in the recent article you wrote, you said that China and Russia will be able to create financial chaos by hiking the gold price. Did you want to talk a little bit more about how the West is not realizing the power that they're giving to China and Russia?
Yeah, I think this is a very important point. What we don't know is how much gold is missing from central bank vaults. There is evidence that there might be quite a lot missing. I mean, we know that a lot was leased. We know that leasing operations have continued. And we've seen the difficulties that the Bundesbank have had trying to get their gold back from New York. So, there is evidence that a lot of the gold which should be there isn't there. Now, if there is an intelligence service in the world that really does know what the position is, I would suggest it's the Russian intelligence service. Um, that knowledge, plus their rapid accumulation of gold, plus China's accumulation of gold, if you like, they know that they can actually destabilize the West by pushing up the gold price and creating chaos at the heart of the Western financial system. Because the one thing that the central banks cannot actually control at the end of the day is the price of gold. If the price of gold shoots up and it discredits, well, it would do two things. It would discredit the validity of paper currencies. But in the short term, and more importantly, with banks running a fractional reserve system based on unallocated accounts, with maybe a tenth of the gold to back them in their vaults or in someone else's vaults, you can see that a sharply higher gold price would basically break the bullion banks. And if you break the bullion banks, you basically break the Western financial system. If they were to do this deliberately, then it would be a nuclear option, a financial nuclear option. I don't think that anyone's actually thinking of doing that at this stage. But I just wonder what happens as the Ukrainian situation deteriorates. I mean, we're now stepping up if you like, certainly the rhetoric, and also we're beginning to send stuff to the Ukraine. Non-lethal aid they call it, which I think is a euphemism for things like troop carriers and things like that. We're now now that we're beginning to, if you like, escalate the situation over the Ukraine, it is quite possible that at some stage the Russians will privately tell the West, look, if you want to continue to do this, then there are going to be nasty consequences. We better sit down and talk about this before things deteriorate much further. And I think that it's not a question of nuclear weapons in the sense of intercontinental ballistic missiles flying all over the place. But I think that the nuclear weapon could well be financial. And there is no doubt at all that with China's stockpile and whatever Russia has, I think that financial nuclear weapon is gold, and that is desperately important. And I do think, incidentally, that when Russia or China start incorporating gold into their currencies in one form or another, then that is going to expose the weaknesses in the West to a frightening degree. So gold is central, actually, to everything. It always has been throughout mankind's history, and it still is today.
Definitely. And before we let you go, I was wondering if we could touch on one last subject. In another article that you wrote about that the euro's status as a currency and as money is really being questioned nowadays. Did you want to discuss a little bit about this?
Yes, what I cited in that article was the Austrian economic point of view, which was really proposed by Ludwig von Mises, that a currency gets its credibility from its history. It's what he called his regression theorem. If you think about gold, I mean, the reason that we've always accepted throughout history gold as money is that it has always been very valuable as an ornament, even before it became money. And interestingly, when Christopher Columbus went over to and discovered your part of the world, what did he find was valued? Gold and silver, completely independently from the Eurasian landmass, where, okay, that we could say that we trade each other with gold and silver. It's acceptable to everybody. That's brilliant. But how is it that the Aztecs and the Incas and all the rest of it value this stuff as well? This is something which is quite remarkable. And I think it's really that independently various societies have discovered the unique qualities of gold in particular and silver as well, for the same reasons, but perhaps slightly to a lesser extent, that make it suitable to be money, if you like, to be that that thing that manages gets you away from the coincidence of wants of barter, so you've got the longest history, if you like, of validity of gold and silver acting as money. Now, paper currencies basically stole their validity from gold or silver acting as money. In the case of gold, in the case of the dollar, it had that veneer of respectability. You could change your dollars into gold up until 1933, from which point it became banned. For private individuals, it still continued for central banks. So the veneer of respectability sort of carried on. And then it all went in 1971 under the Nixon shock. But the reason that we accept the dollar as a reserve currency is that it does have this long history of acting as money, even though it stole its original validity out of precious metals. Now we come and we consider the euro. There was no transition whatsoever between the previous currencies and the euro. I mean, what happened was that overnight, suddenly, the Deutschmarks, the French francs, the Italian lira, the Greek drachmas, and all the rest of them, they were illegal, if you like, from the point of view of being used for transactions. And they were replaced by the euro. It was just an overnight job. So the euro had no history behind it whatsoever. The only thing it had is what we might call the full faith and credit of the European Central Bank. Ha ha. Now, the problem is that as the Eurozone institutions come under pressure, then obviously this starts raising questions about the validity of this upstart currency. And we're beginning to see this with the threat that various countries, I mean, at the moment, very topically, Greece, might want to leave the Eurozone. In fact, as far as Greece is concerned, if they have got much sense at all, what they will do is admit that they're bankrupt, which the finance minister has stated is the case, and withdraw from the Eurozone and renege on her debts. And suddenly she will have removed the burden of around about 360 billion euros equivalent. Now that could well happen. Even if it doesn't happen, we're beginning to sort of ask questions about the euro. And then we start asking questions about what happens if Germany decides to leave this euro. These are questions which have been being asked really ever since the Lehman crisis, and certainly since the Eurozone crisis started erupting in about 2011. This is very, very important. As people start asking these questions, then the confidence starts going from the currency. And guess what happens? It slides from something like 140 to the dollar to the current level of 106. And that's been over the last, 7, 8 months? That's quite a slide in a currency. And the ECB at this particular point in time decides to get all monetary-like and Keynesian-like and try and stave off deflation, falling prices, by going into massive QE. It hasn't actually got anything to buy because all the bonds are locked up in the banks. But you've got this ridiculous situation where, at the one moment when they should be trying to impart confidence or underwriting confidence in the euro, actually they're doing the reverse. They're trying to destroy it. So I think that the outlook for the euro is actually very, very poor. And I've felt this for some considerable time.
I know that you've said that the euro could actually be the Achilles heel of the whole global financial system. Did you want to discuss a little bit about how that might be?
Well, the Eurozone is the second largest economic area, as it were, after the United States, if I can call the United States an economic area rather than a country. The GDP is something like $12 trillion, 12 or $13 trillion. I mean, if you get a currency collapse in an economic area like that, then it's bound to affect the other countries, not least because not only are we so integrated in terms of trade and trade payments, but also through the banking system. The banking system is very integrated, and we see that if one country does QE, it affects the liquidity everywhere. Why? Because the banks, through the financial markets, move to arbitrage differences. And if you've got lots of liquidity in one area, that tends to get arbitraged out into another area. So it is actually quite serious for a major currency like the euro to get into difficulties. It is bound to affect the rest of the world. And we're already seeing this. I mean, if you look at it from the dollar's point of view, I know that the dollar, fortunately, or America, fortunately, has 80% of her GDP is all internal, and so imports, exports are sort of a fairly small part of the overall economy. But with the dollar going up against the euro, you can immediately see that this is having a negative effect on corporate profits, American corporate profits, particularly for the multinationals. And so, what it amounts to is that you've got one currency which is seriously weakening, and this is going to bring greater pressure on the Fed to try and manage her currency down as well. Now, whether they do this through currency swaps or delaying interest rate rises or whatever, we'll have to see. But I really think that if this situation goes much further than this, then we will get action from the Fed to try and stem the dollar's rise.
Well, Alasdair MacLeod, thank you so much for joining us today. Before we let you go, did you want to share with the viewers where they can find you?
Yeah, sure. I'm head of research for Gold Money, and that's goldmoney.com. And I've also got my own blog, which is financeandeconomics.org.
Great. Once again, thank you so much for your time, Alasdair MacLeod.
My pleasure.
This video was brought to you by ReluctantPreppers.com. Click here to watch Reluctant Prepper's latest interview with G. Edward Griffin, author of The Creature from Jekyll Island, a second look at the Federal Reserve. In this interview, G. Edward Griffin examines whether it is possible for us to abolish the Federal Reserve. Now, for a clip from the interview.
The people in power are crooks. They're criminals, and they don't care. And they just will do whatever they can to plunder the American people as long as they can get away with it. That's fact number one. The Supreme Court will not touch this issue. This issue has never been brought to the Supreme Court. If it were to be brought to there today, those guys there sitting on the bench would say, we're not going to touch this thing. That potato is too hot. They're just going to turn their back on the Constitution.